Hi, welcome back to Anthropology 127, Introduction to Archaeological Sciences. So this is the third in a series of short clips where I'm telling you about what's happening in our first lecture. So I will go ahead and share screen again, and we'll keep going. Okay, what we're doing now then is moving to a bit of disciplinary history. Where did archaeology come from? As we talked about last time, archaeology is a sort of a counterintuitive way of finding out about the past. And it didn't have anything like the long developmental history of written history. So the question is, where did it come from? And what were the circumstances that created archaeology as a discipline? Collecting old objects goes back a long way. People have done this for a long time. And people become very interested in old objects and developed a sort of a real hobby. This is often talked about as an antiquarian interest in the past. Antiquarians were people who often were very knowledgeable about objects of the past, but that wasn't their day job. This is something they're doing as a hobby. The question is, how do you go from creating a hobby to creating interest groups and clubs to creating an actual profession with standards and a place where you actually have a job and get paid for it? So the past has had lots of examples of past people being interested in their own past. The Maya collected Olmec jade, and this was something that they made use of in probably ritual deposits. In China, in the Tang period, roughly equivalent to the later Roman Empire in the West, Tang scholars collected much earlier bronzes from the Shang period, like this elaborate vase you see here. And that was a method of them using the past to try to change their own present. Because Tang scholars were lobbying very hard to have an examination system put in place, which would replace some of the people being promoted because of their relatives, because they were aristocracy. And they were presenting this not as a new revolutionary thing, that's going back to good old days, the way things used to be done back in the far past. So when scholars displayed these objects, they were making a political statement. And it was so popular that they won. That's why you take exams today. But also they created such a demand for these objects from the past that clever people in their own time, bronzesmiths, learned to make fakes. So an awful lot of the bronzes which we have today in museums, including that, turn out to be actually Tang manufactured copies or fakes, created fakes from the Shang bronzes. So thousands of years apart. So this is a case of people creatively using objects from the past so they don't change from the present, but it didn't lead to the discipline of archaeology, despite the long-standing Chinese interest and skill in thinking about their own past. Strange enough, this took the European Renaissance period, princes and warfare. And that's our story by getting us to archaeology. Now, in the Renaissance, roughly the 1400s to the early 1600s, a bunch of things were coming together. A whole bunch of texts from the classical past, the late Roman past in particular, that have been lost in the West, have been retained, often in Arabic translation in the Islamic world. And these texts began to come into the European world, mostly through Italy, eventually got translated back into Latin, Greek, and became very widespread. And these were the classics as people understood them. Now, at the same time, people who read them realize there's lots of really good practical information in these how-to manuals, which is what many of them were. How to organize armies, how to cast large bronze objects, how to use water pressure to create fountains. Now, these are all things the Romans wrote about and that people just thought was great, and they started building these things. And so here you see a beautiful fountain from Copenhagen, squirting water, again, borrowed from Roman techniques. And on the other side, there's an equestrian statue of the Condottiere, or warlord, Francisco Sforza in Milan. And you can see he is in the same pose as Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor from centuries before. Now, this is also all about gunpowder, because one of the things that comes to mind is if you can cast a big bronze statue successfully, you can also cast big bronze cannons. And there's a picture of one which the Turks built to knock down the old ancient walls of Constantinople in 1453 and conquer the city. So one of the things that was happening in the Renaissance period was lots of change and lots of information coming from the past that turned out to be very practical for people trying to survive the present and innovate And then you see also there's a plan of a star-shaped star fortification. This is the new kind of gunpowder-resistant fortification, popularized first in Italy, this is Fosse Italiane, and which then spread to the rest of Europe. So things are happening. And a lot of it has to do with recovering information from the past and applying it creatively to the present. Here we have Mauritz van Nassau, who is a Protestant ruler of what's now Low Countries in Holland and its allies. And he made use of a late Roman military writer, Vegetius, to better organize his troops and, of course, introduce techniques from the past while also adding in gunpowder. And he turned out to be very successful, and this is one of the reasons why he was able to defeat the Spanish and why the Dutch were independent. So this was a practical application from things from the past. This also resulted in people wanting to collect objects from the past. There's always been interest in classical statuary coming out of people's back gardens or in excavations. But now, as the past became really relevant to the present, the Renaissance, this collection really took off. So if you wanted to suck up to a big prince or the Pope, you would find a nice bust of Homer or a big sarcophagus like this one you see here, and you give it to them. You know, the perfect Christmas gift. So as a result, elites of various sorts began to accumulate large collections of classical works of art. And of course, this is the basis for things like the Vatican Museum, the Uffizi Gallery today. If you go to Italy, you can go see these places. Further out from Italy and further down the princely food chain, you had local level elites who also wanted to collect things. It became a big deal to have what they called cabinets of curiosities. And here you can see an illustration from the 1600s of a cabinet of curiosity from Spain, where, well, they've got everything going, haven't they? They've got stuffed animals hanging from the roof. They've got all kinds of things in their cabinets there. And you might just be able to make out in the center there are a bunch of knives and daggers and some stone tools. So some of the things that are winding from these cabinets of curiosity would be today thought as the natural history specimens or archaeology specimens, and that they're all gemmed together. By the 1600s, these cabinets of curiosity sometimes were huge, not just a single room, but whole palaces began to be taken over. So that gets us to a story about the use of these artifacts. And as you see, read the text associated with this slide, and you'll see that I'm talking about how two different people are coming together, two highly educated men, diplomats, in Copenhagen in the early 1600s. And the Dane and the Spaniard had a wonderful day sort of looking at fountains, looking at gunpowder, fortifications, and then they wind up in the Royal Cabinet of Curiosities. And by this point, the Danish Royal Cabinet of Curiosities takes up a whole wing of a palace. It's huge. So they have a great time comparing notes about the Roman coins. And they can understand the Roman coins. As you can see, there's brief worn inscriptions there, but they're classically trained scholars. They've had Greek and Latin beaten into them. They are speaking to each other in Latin, which is their common language. So these are no fools, and they are quite able to talk about the different Roman emperors you're seeing there and talk about their reigns and all the rest of it. And it's all very satisfactory. They're showing off, but they're showing their education and where it came from. And then you get cabinets like full of things like this. This is this hand axe. We know it's a prehistoric tool made tens of thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And the problem is in Denmark, that's mostly what you find because it was outside of the Roman Empire. You do not find all those wonderful things that the Pope gets to put in the Vatican Library. You find some Roman coins, and sure, you can understand them. But then you find all these things like this stone tool. Now, the problem isn't that the Dane and Spaniard don't know what this is. They both have explanations, but they're different. Like most people in the Mediterranean, the Spanish ambassador knows that this is a coagulated thunderbolt. This is what happens when a lightning strike, you go there, you find one of these things. The Dane also knows what it is, but he knows something different. He knows that this is actually elf shot. You know, elves, little guys live in forests, have pointy ears. The other thing about elves in Northern European mythology is they can't stand the touch of iron, so they use stone tools instead, and that's what you find. Now, problem is, of course, both of these are folk explanations, and I don't think either ambassador probably feels too comfortable about that, at least not the level of certainty it has about talking to the Roman emperors. And also the problem is, where did those explanations come from? Not from a common classical education, being beaten into them by the tutors, but almost certainly from their nannies. Very unacceptable source. So you have this problem of these cabins of curiosities are just full of all this stuff that you can't explain, and people don't like that. They want to get an explanation. They want to find out what's going on with this stuff. And then we have troublesome monuments like Stonehenge, like many other great henge monuments in Northwestern Europe. These are hard to ignore, and they are right there. And what are they about? So they are also things that you have to try to figure out what they're made of, what they're from. And it's not that there weren't further explanations, but increasingly those are seen as inadequate. You have to do something else. So thinking about Stonehenge, who built it? Initially, the surveyors who went to see Stonehenge in the early 1600s had first visited Salisbury Cathedral, which is only a few miles away, medieval cathedral. They were able to look at the records of when it was built and who built it, why. Makes sense. Then they went out to Salisbury Plain to Stonehenge, and boy, that's what is this thing? The local farmers had an explanation. They said that Merlin, the magician, had caused these stones to dance all the way from Wales, and you can see they're still dancing in their ring. Okay, they guys just did not believe this. In fact, we now know that those stones actually, a bunch of them did come from Wales. They probably didn't dance, but they did wind up there. Okay, so in 1620, Inigo Jones, who was a royal architect, and who'd taken the tour, he'd been to Italy, he'd seen the Roman temples. He decided it was just a provincial Roman temple. They just did a really bad job putting together. Nah. In 1663, Dr. Carleton decided this is where the Danes in the Dark Ages had their coronations, and it wouldn't be great if we did this again. You can see he's thinking about selling popcorn because he's a local landowner. In 1676, Islet Sams, who actually excavated Stonehenge, decided this must have been built by the Phoenicians. Who are the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians are seafaring people that existed in the Iron Age and into the early classical period. They were the enemies of the Romans. And the two things the Romans knew about them was they were tricky, and the other thing about them was they're incredible sailors. And they were supposed to go in all sorts of places, and they were very close-mouthed. They didn't tell you where they went. So the Romans and the Carthaginians fought it out in a huge war. Carthaginians lost, Phoenicians lost, and their cities were destroyed, and their language was more or less wiped out. They lost. And again, the winners write history. So almost everything we know about the Phoenicians is written by the Romans. The question is, where did the Phoenicians go? I mean, other question is, where did they not go? Now, actually, it turns out we are pretty sure the Phoenicians did probably circumnavigate the coast of Africa. How about that? Phoenician pottery has been found down along the coast of Africa, and at least some of it on the eastern coast. And how it got there? Good question, but there's something happened. So it's not out of question that the Phoenicians did, in fact, go to Britain, which then was a source of tin for making bronze. Could have happened. But did they construct Stonehenge? In 1680, John Aubrey decided it was the Druids. Who are the Druids? The Druids are the priests of the Celtic people who were in Britain when Caesar gets there in 44 BC. He invades. And of course, as he invades, he brings history because he's literate. And so the rest of his guys. And they write an account of, he writes an account of his attack on the Britons, eventually unsuccessfully leaves. And he writes about the Druids. He doesn't like them, they don't like him. But one of the things about the Druids is that they memorize their magic and they won't write it down. So you can see who gets again to write history. But when Caesar gets there, when history arrives in Britain, in the part of Britain where the Stonehenge lies in the south, the Druids are the priests. So maybe it was made by and for Druids. In the 1740s, by the time John Stukeley, who also excavated Stonehenge, got there, he also worked nearby big stone enclosure in Avebury and decided it was the sacred landscape of the Druids. And he made up a special language, a Druidical language, based on modern Welsh, which modern Druids, who date back to John Stukeley anyway, still speak when they make their pilgrimage to Stonehenge at Midsummer's Day. So the idea of this becoming something attached to Druids or Danish Vikings in the Dark Ages, or Phoenicians, people on the edge of history, was, that was the direction people were trying to go in explaining this monument. Unfortunately for them, of course, it's tremendously ancient. It was much older than that. They were wrong. Now, none of these people were fools, but they're all trying to get at prehistory by using the tools of history. Wrong tool for the job. Okay, so one thing to recognize is that by about 1500 or so, language skills, transcription, publication, numismatics, coin studies, and inscriptions on standing buildings were all heavily studied. I mean, people were doing a really good job of getting at history back to the classical period. But what about the hand axes and megaliths? You know, this is where you're getting the elves, the Druids, and Phoenicians, and Vikings. You know, people that are either folklore or on the edge of history. They're mentioned by somebody else, but we don't know much about them. Can you prove they didn't do it? So the other question, though, is there a deep past beyond the limits of history, beyond the limits of literacy? And if there is, how to get to it? Big question. Okay, so we have, by the middle of the 18th century, a bit of a crisis. There's lots of artifacts and collections. The cabin of curiosity is huge. People digging. There's lots of people going out there, aristocrats, but also sort of middle class folks, going out and having a nice time digging holes and barrows and finding things. Now, one of my friends and colleagues who works in the Stonehenge area in southern Britain has said that if he had a time machine, what he would do would be go back not to the time Stonehenge was being built, but just back to about 1805 with a gun, and he'd shoot these people. Because what they were doing, of course, is, you know, they would typically go out with, you know, 3 carriages, one for the gentlemen, one for the ladies, one for the wine. And the workmen who did the work would walk behind. And they would dig big holes, and people would have a nice picnic and salute each find. The problem is they didn't pay any attention to stratigraphy, any attention to depth. They didn't bring, from our standpoint, enough bags. Everything went in the same sack. So, of course, they found these incredible objects, amazing, beautiful things which have never been found since. And we have no real idea where they came from. So that's a problem. Too few notes. And of course, if you did get your time machine, go back and shoot these people, you'd immediately create the classic time travel paradox. What happens if you go back and accidentally kill your great-great-grandfather? Because these people are our ancestors intellectually, despite the problems. Okay, at the same time, exploration and colonization taking place. Remember, this is the period of expansion of European empires, are finding lost cities and creating all sorts of controversies. As we'll see. Importantly, the Royal Society of Antiquaries of London is founded in 1751 at the Bear Tavern, where they got together to drink and also to talk. And this was the first archaeological society in the world, and it's still with us. So this is a big deal because it means that people are coming together and talking about their finds and comparing notes and beginning that stage of moving from individual collectors to a club. And this is the same sort of thing that happens when people do things like stamp collecting, is you get a lot more out of it. You learn more, you share information, you share wisdom by coming together regularly and chatting, and they did. So this was a big deal. So things are happening here. This is a moment where things are changing. Now, in the United States, there's a huge controversy of what people call the mound builders. In the Ohio Valley and into the Mississippi Valley and its tributaries, there are some amazing, huge earthworks. Some of them, as the one you see here, form images as a serpent mound. Some of them are just really big. The Monk's Mound in Cahokia is about the same size as the north building of Hunter College. Huge. So these are earthwork monuments which are hard to ignore, and they require somebody to explain them. By the time that the European trappers and traders got there, they had been abandoned. So it wasn't quite clear who made them. And people came up with creative ideas. Lost tribes of Israel. You know, there are some tribes who appear in the Bible who disappeared. Did they wind up in North America? Phoenicians. Here we go again. Can you prove that they weren't? Okay, Phoenicians again. Or was it Native Americans? So there's lots of publication speculation in places like New York and Philadelphia by people who had never actually been there and were making a case. Importantly, there's also lots of land speculation because this is a period when Europeans, Americans were trying to divide up the Indians' land. And this was a case of chucking them off and taking their stuff and doing a little genocide at the side. And of course, it becomes easier to do that if you are assuming that these people are a bunch of naked savages who couldn't possibly have constructed something as spectacular as this. Yeah, that's the way it was. Okay, which gets us to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson did lots of things, but one of the things he also was a correspondent of the Royal Society. He was interested in archaeology and the past, and he went out systematically, as this painting shows you, and dug up one of the big mounds, which is on his property in Virginia. And as you can see, they actually paid attention to where burials were relative to each other. There's layers of the dirt here. And they did actually a stratigraphic excavation and paid attention to the finds. He also, very importantly, used what we call today ethnographic analogy. He demonstrated that the pots and other artifacts that he got from the mounds were quite similar to the pottery being used still by Native American groups in the area. He also observed Native American groups in the area had relationships with mounds, they had reverence for them, they still buried people in them. So it wasn't that this was something alien to them. So we correctly decided that these were monuments of Native Americans, full stop. And that more or less dealt with controversy. So Jefferson often is described as the father of American archaeology. There may be some truth to this. Notice, though, that the guys that are doing the digging are all enslaved Africans. So that's part of this story as well. Okay, so we have then the issue of going from a hobby to a discipline. And a discipline has a paradigm, which is essentially a set of rules about what's worth doing, how to do it, methods, and also standards. You know, how do you do this? Now, in the 19th century, people had both a theory problem and a method problem. The theory problem was the short chronology, which then existed with the idea that the Earth was not very old. The Earth was created somewhere around 4004 BC. Now, that's what you can do if you use Genesis in the Bible and the genealogies associated with it to basically count back. And eventually you get through all the begats to Adam's birthday, and that's when the world starts. And the Irishman, Bishop Ussher, in 1642, came up with an initial calculation of 4004 BC. An Englishman, Lightfoot, in 1700, got this down to 9 o'clock in the morning on October 23rd of 4004, which, as many people point out, is about when the Oxford term started. Now, it's easy to present this as a joke, but it wasn't. These were highly skilled people. They were simply using the wrong term of tools. They were really trying to use history to get at deep prehistory, and they didn't really have a sense of just how old the Earth was. But people were beginning to suspect it was far older than 4004, even in 1700. Okay, so we had a methods problem, as we've seen, the constant use of tools of history being applied to prehistory. You know, you're using a chisel for a screwdriver, it doesn't work well. So increasingly, there were borrowings from the other discipline beginning to together, actually before us, geology. So geology and natural history began to come together in the early part of the 19th century and really took off the middle. And they were looking at things like stratigraphic recording, superposition, as we'll see, uniformitarian assumptions. This is a period when extinctions and discoveries both were shaking the paradigm of people like Bishop Ussher. Species were going extinct. The dodo, the great auk, others. That wasn't supposed to happen. Species were created once and for all and were supposed to exist pretty much forever. So that suggested extinction in the past may have taken place too, maybe on a pretty large scale. Also, as you can see a lower photo there, this is a bunch of miners showing some gentlemen bones of what actually turned out to be mosasaur, a marine reptile from the dinosaur age. A recognition that, wow, nothing like that's around today. And it's buried deep in the rocks. This made it from a long time ago. So the idea then that extinction was possible and extinction happened ties into the notion of Earth having a great long past. And geology and natural history are really taking off. And people are finding and collecting the bones of spectacularly different animals that live today. Here's a picture of Mary Anning, who was a famous woman of her own, who supported herself in her widowhood by collecting monsters from along the coast of Devonshire and Dorset. So she was a very skilled field paleontologist. A whole lot of her preparations, you can see the British Museum today. There's an ichthyosaur skeleton there. And she corresponded with people from the Royal Society. She was very aware of them. They were very aware of her. They visited back and forth and drank tea together. And she turned out to make a pretty good living in selling these fossils. So Mary Anning is famous in Dorset, and you can go and see these cliffs today, and they're still animals weathering out. So geology and natural history began to come together. So there's a history of nature, natural history. History has nature, nature has a history, which suggests that tools of geology can get us back into a deeper history than exists in the written record. So stratigraphy revealed great changes. And they're all in the same order. You know, you have trilobites at the bottom, and then dinosaurs in the middle, and then mammoths at the top. It's never the other way around. And even people go across the ocean, they go to different parts of the world, they observe the same broad similarities, whether you're in India or in Canada. So this is the sort of thing that people begin to observe in the field. The idea that Earth has history, and the idea of change through time, of forms through evolution, through extinction, is widely discussed. And Darwin does not introduce the concept of evolution. It's been out there for a while. Here you can see there's a French cartoon satirizing early scientific conferences. These are the ichthyosaurs coming together to discuss humans. So there you go. I'll stop here for now, and then we'll go ahead and do some more on the next installment coming right up.